In looking at the current status of GM crops, I want to look at the world's most important crops. Then I want to have a look at GM crops. I want to have a look at the traits which are actually being expressed in GM crops, which are actually being grown. If you look first at the acreage of transgenic crops, and the data is a little bit behind the present day. The most recent review I could actually get was 2006, but you can see that there's been a linear increase in the acreage of transgenic crops since they were first introduced in 1995. The world's most important crops: wheat, rice, corn, barley, sorghum and millet. This is cassava. Also there are root crops: cassava and potato. Pulses like soybean. So this is the acreage of the world's most important crops in terms of wheat, rice, corn, barley, sorghum, soybeans, millet, canola, potato and cassava. The red ones are GM crops. So you can see that there's a substantial acreage of GM corn, a reasonable acreage of GM soybeans, and a small acreage of GM canola. This is oilseed rape. But the world's biggest crops, wheat and rice, there's basically very, very little. It's so small it doesn't even register on this. And other crops like barley and sorghum also have a tiny acreage of GM crops. And the reason for this is because most of the world's most important crops, so wheat, rice, corn, barley, sorghum and millet, they're all monocots. Monocotyledonous plants are much more difficult to regenerate from a single transformed cell than are the dicotyledonous plants. And within the dicots there is a range of ease of regeneration. In terms of types of GM crops, soybean and corn are the major GM crops. So basically what's happened is that a single manufacturer has actually gone in and decided that they have a particular trait they want to put into crops. They've looked at the acreage that was grown in the USA and they said, right, huge acreage of soybeans and corn and cotton and oilseed rape grown in the US. We'll concentrate on those crops. We'll improve the regeneration systems for those crops and we'll put the genes into those crops. Potato is very, very easy to regenerate. Not the easiest crop to regenerate, but compared to corn and soybean, it's a piece of cake. But the acreage of transgenic potatoes is tiny because it's not considered a very large crop on a world scale. People just haven't put the effort in. If you look at the States, so that was worldwide, if you look at the States, 93% of the soybean crop in the US is GM. 99% of the Argentine soybean crop is genetically modified. Half of US corn, 95% of Canadian oilseed rape is now genetically modified. So it has had a huge impact in certain areas. In terms of the type of genetic modification, in blue here, herbicide tolerant soybean. Most of that is glyphosate resistance. Then we have herbicide tolerant corn, herbicide tolerant cotton, herbicide tolerant oilseed rape or canola. And then we have the others. So 70%, more than 70% of transgenic crops are herbicide resistance, 24% are insect resistance, and less than 1% of other traits. The vast majority of the herbicide tolerance is glyphosate resistance. The vast majority of insect resistance is Bacillus thuringiensis crystal toxin. Does it work? At the top here, in A, on the left you've got non-GM, on the right you've got genetically modified with herbicide resistance. Same in B. Same in C, they're reversed in D, and reversed in E. So you can see that and these are all different herbicides that the plants are resistant to. So you can see that herbicide resistance does work. In terms of approved transgenic plants, again this is from about 2006, there are a whole load of approved transgenic plants. Soybean, corn, cotton, oilseed rape, sugar beet, squash, tomato, tobacco, carnations, potato, flax, papaya, chicory, rice, melon. You can see that some of the world's biggest crops are not there. So wheat, they're still struggling to produce transgenic wheat. And the reason for this is largely because of the difficulties in regenerating whole plants back from single transformed cells. I'm going to very quickly go over problems and potential. In terms of future traits and methodology, environmental stress resistance is going to become much more important. With irrigation comes dramatically improved yields of crops. One of the problems with irrigation is that you apply water to the soil, the water evaporates or is lost from the plant via transpiration, but the salts can't evaporate and they're retained in the soil. So you progressively get salinization of the soil. It's becoming a problem in many parts of the world now, where land which was previously very highly productive is now actually becoming quite difficult to grow crops on because of the high salt content. Edible vaccines I've already mentioned. Post-harvest quality I've already mentioned. Plantibodies, the ease of regeneration, ease of growth, ease of production of transgenic yeast and bacteria, and the costs of actually producing large quantities of yeast and bacteria is such that we probably won't see very large amounts of antibodies being produced from plants. Biodegradable plastics? Very possibly. We're running out of oil, we're running out of alternatives to oil, and it's possible that there are going to be biodegradable plastics produced from plants. I've already mentioned polyhydroxybutyrate. Fungal resistance might be a big one. One that I think is going to be huge in the future is targeting to the chloroplast. So producing transplastomic plants where you have genes targeted to the chloroplast. I'll be talking about this at length in a future lecture. Organ-specific expression. We've got lots of organ-specific promoters now. Antibiotic-free selection is it's already been demonstrated in transgenic rice, where they didn't put in any antibiotic resistance genes in order to select, and the only method of selection was through a fluorescent protein, and they're able to produce transgenic rice simply by looking for fluorescent cells. Gene stability in more crop species, these are all a given. Final slide, problems with GM foods. Some people think that it's unethical to meddle with nature. If you're a member of the Soil Association, you're producing organic crops, contamination of your crops with GM pollen can be highly problematical. The Soil Association will reject a crop if there is 1 part in 15,000 GM. So if you've got 1 seed in 15,000 seeds which is GM, they will reject your crop. Now this is a problem for the Soil Association and organic growers. Lack of public choice. The agricultural companies are producing GM crops And a lot of the, so for example GM soybean, almost all of the soybean in Argentina, a large proportion of it in the States is GM. And they're producing soybean and soybean products that find their way into a great variety of different foods. So for example, if you're eating a pork pie, you'll probably find that it's got some soybean components in it. And because so much of the world production of soybeans is GM, it's difficult to actually get pork pies without having some GM products in it. So you've got a lack of public choice. If you definitely don't want to eat GM products, then you may have a problem. Allergic reactions have actually been brought up. Now, allergic reactions are one of the things which is tested for when people are looking at producing GM crops. But again, it doesn't stop those who say, oh, I'm allergic to peanuts, and you might be putting peanut protein into this particular food. And finally, generation of superweeds. So basically it's like anything else. The more you use herbicides, the more likely you are to actually get transgenic or get resistant weeds. In the same way that the more you use antibiotics, the more you're going to get antibiotic resistance bacteria. And it's already happening in organically grown crops. So organic growers are actually growing up the bacterium that produces Bacillus thuringiensis crystal toxin in large-scale fermentations and spraying the bacterium on their crop, and they're starting to get superweeds being produced, which are actually it's the biting insects that would eat the crops that are becoming resistant to Bt crystal toxin. And they're already seeing this in Canada in organic crops, so it's not just a matter of GM. Some people are worried about transfer of antibiotic resistance genes, so things like kanamycin resistance is actually put into plants to allow us to select for them. We're talking about this when I talk about protocols. But some people seem to think all this antibiotic resistance is going to get into the bugs that are in my stomach, and I'm going to end up with antibiotic resistant E. coli in my stomach. It's going to outgrow everything else. I'm not going to be able to treat any infections that I have. It's a complete nonsense that the DNA is actually digested in the stomach under acid conditions, and there's a huge selection pressure in your gut anyway for antibiotic resistance. Reactivation of latent viruses is one potential. If you actually have a look at, you do a search through GenBank, actually have a look for virus sequences, you will find, so for example I looked for corn mosaic virus in corn. I did find that some of the upstream sequences, some of the promoters for corn mosaic virus were actually present in the database of DNA sequences. So at some stage in the past, corn has become infected with corn mosaic virus. Part of that genome has been actually eliminated, so you don't actually get production of the viruses, but part of it is actually being retained. So through GM it may be possible to reactivate latent viruses. It's something that actually needs to be borne in mind. Toxins may be engineered into plants, or some people have said, well, simply genetically modifying plants will actually lead to production of toxins in plants. They've never actually specified a mechanism for this, they're just worried about it. Loss of diversity is a huge one. Ever since we actually introduced agriculture, the wild species have been outcompeted. We've been roguing them out, planting crop species in their place. And because of this, there are risks of loss of diversity. But it's not specific to GM crops, it's agriculture in general. and poisoning reduction of beneficial insects. If you're spraying with a pesticide, you're going to kill beneficial insects as well as harmful insects, and the same applies to if you put the poison actually into the plant itself.